ladies and gentlemen. This is the TMNT show. That's short for myself, Tyler Moore, and my co-host,
Noel Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about Piaget's theory of cognitive development. This is building off of our episode last week when we talked about educational psychology as an introduction and how it affects teacher decision-making.
Piaget was a Swiss psychologist that developed his theories in the 1920s. Piaget wanted to know the mental process of children. He wanted to know how they thought, learned, perceived, and remembered things.
And that's really interesting because the thing about Piaget's understandings in the research is that he wanted to tie together the ideas of biology and cognitive processes. And by that I mean, as we mature through different stages in life, our brains mature, and by doing so, we're able to think more complexly about different subjects, whether it be abstract reasoning, critical thinking, or logical development.
So today we're going to take you through the basic assumptions of Piaget's theories, the 4 stages of Piaget's cognitive development theory, how it can be applied in the classroom, and finally opposing views. So let's get started.
Yeah.
So Piaget's basic assumptions were that children were active and motivated learners, and they construct knowledge through experiences. Further, Piaget argues that children learn through 2 complementary processes of assimilation and accommodation.
Assimilation and accommodation? What does that mean, Noel?
Well, assimilation is when a child discovers a new object or event.
Oh.
And accommodation is when a child modifies that object or event with a new one.
Okay, that's interesting. That kind of goes with the other basic assumptions where learning happens when children interact with their social and physical environment, and also that development can only occur after the neurological changes happen within the brain. And if you take these assumptions to heart as a teacher, they're going to be really helpful in the classroom. Well, Noel, now that we know Piaget's basic assumptions, how are we supposed to use his theory as teachers?
Well, Piaget's theory gives a good insight of how children think at different stages in their life. He also argues that children have to go through each stage in the same process.
So then you're saying then, as teachers, once we understand the development of students' thinking, we're able to adjust our teaching strategies and how the curriculum is?
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
So let's go to stage 1.
The first stage of Piaget's theory is a sensormodal stage, which happens from the ages of 0 to 2 years old. This stage is all about behaviors and perceptions, and by that, Piaget means that kids are not yet able to comprehend things beyond their immediate space. An example of that is that when you play peekaboo with your kid, every time you put your hands over like this, the kid thinks they're gone, and that's why it's always a surprise. Children are also starting to understand the idea of cause and effect relationships. Another example would that be whenever a kid starts to cry, they know they're going to get attention from their parents. This is at the very early stage, not necessarily applicable for teachers, but when we get there, you'll hear about stage 2.
Stage 2 of Piaget's theory is the pre-operational stage. Here, children between the age of 2 and 7 develop how to think of objects that are not in their immediate view.
Okay.
This allows them to have the beginning of true thought. Piaget also describes that between the ages of 2 and 7, children develop vocabulary, which allows them to express their thoughts and to receive information in a new way. Children around the age of 4 and 5 also develop the ability to think logically. However, most of their logical reasoning is based on assumptions and guesses and hunches. However, at this stage, children lack the understanding of conservation.
Conservation, an understanding of conservation. That's an interesting theory. Do you have any evidence that supports that?
I do. So, Piaget gives the example of if you have a student named Johnny in front of you and you give him 2 glasses of water that are filled at the exact same level, and you ask Johnny, are both of these glasses filled at the exact same level? Johnny would say yes. Then, if you pour one glass into a taller glass that has the exact same amount of water, and you ask Johnny, do both glasses have the same amount of water? He would say no, the taller one does.
Why would he say that, Noel?
Because he's lacking conservation.
Oh.
So the main idea for stage 2 is to implement many experiences within the child's development. That way he can learn at his own rate.
Now that we know about stage 2, it's time to talk about stage 3, the concrete operation stage. This occurs from the years of 6 to 11. And what happens in this stage is when the adult-like logical reasoning starts to appear within children. And by that, it means that they're starting to realize that their own thoughts is not necessarily representative of everyone's reality. An example of that would be when you're trying to share something. Normally, when kids are at a younger stage in their lives, they wouldn't ask before sharing because they think, because I want this, that other kid must want me to want this too. So now the children are going to start asking before taking. And another thing that kids are able to do is multiple classification and deductive reasoning. Multiple classification is when kids are able to classify things in a broad spectrum, whether it be different types of animals or cars. And deductive reasoning, Noel, I'm glad you asked, is when we know not to do things based on deductive logic. It's a little tricky, but the way I've understood it is that if you see a stove and you see it's red hot, what does that mean you don't do?
It means you don't touch it.
That's right. Before in the first 2 stages, kids won't be able to figure that out for the most part. But as you reach stage 3, you're able to understand these things and you're on the ways to thinking more logically.
Stage 4 in Piaget's theory is the formal operational stage. This is from students from 12 years old until adulthood. Here, students develop logical reasoning for abstract ideas. Teenagers can increasingly reason logically about alternatives to reality as well, and they can recognize that logically valid reason is different from what is true in the world. An example of this is if you tell a student that all students are basketballs and all basketballs are jelly beans, thus for all jelly beans are students.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah. All right, so kids are also more sophisticated in this stage, and you can give them more complicated mathematical and scientific work. An article by Enos Simatwa on instructional management shows that teachers should encourage their students to think more critically and to explain their thoughts, particularly regarding abstractions. Teachers should also give assignments that encourage open-ended questions. So now that we learned Piaget's theory, what are some of the challenges to his theory?
Well, there's a couple problems with Piaget's theory, and one of them comes from Vygotsky, who was working in the 1930s. He created this socio-cultural perspective of constructing knowledge, because with Piaget, it was all centered on the individual and not wider society. But another problem I've had with it is that, can we really see development in 4 rigid stages?
Well, some psychologists argue that cognitive development isn't as linear as Piaget suggests, and that development occurs unevenly across content areas. For example, some psychologists argue that Piaget underestimated elementary school children that can think abstractly, and overestimated high school children that don't always use the formal operational thinking.
So with that, how can we apply this in the classroom? Here are some useful teaching tips for you as aspiring teachers. First and foremost, you need to recognize your students' learning and use specific instructional strategies. By that, you have to construct your students' learning based off of their foundational knowledge.
And remember these tips when teaching Jimmy. Whenever possible, use concrete examples and visual aid to help your students learn. Don't expect little Jimmy to see from someone else's viewpoint. And use hands-on practice as building blocks for more complex learning, such as critical thinking and languages.
Most of all, you need to tailor your curriculum to where your students are developmentally. So you don't need to be going too fast or too slow, but you need to be moving at the speed just right for your students. Thank you very much. This is another episode of TMMT. I'm Tyler Moore. With me is Noel Tremblay. And we are out, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good night and study hard.